So when Stormy Daniels describes all of those details and the room, the furniture, the pajamas, where they were sitting, and telling the story consistently for more than a dozen years in different venues, how difficult is it for the defense in cross-examination to argue that she's lying?
I think it's going to be challenging, and candidly, I think that the defense made a bit of a mistake here by not admitting that this took place. Really, legally speaking, their defense is not that this didn't take place. I don't even know why it matters whether it took place or not. The bottom line is they wanted to pay a lot of money to keep this account out of the media, to keep this out of the public eye. That's really Donald Trump's pride and hubris getting in the way of a proper defense of this case. And I really think that is what gave the prosecution the leeway from the judge to get into some of these details, which I think it's obvious are embarrassing, damaging, and it's a really difficult line for the defense to cross when they try to go after Stormy Daniels, because if they go too hard at her, she can be a very sympathetic person. There's a power dynamic not just between Trump and herself, but also between these fancy New York lawyers and her. And so if they attack her, they could potentially create sympathy for her amongst the jury. So they're going to have to proceed very carefully.
Duncan, I want to ask you about a couple of words that Renato just used, which are embarrassing and damaging, which are two different things, right? Embarrassing, I think we can all agree that if you're in a very public space and someone is talking about an alleged sexual encounter, nobody wants to have that description. But before this even happened, there was apparently an argument with the judge that the defense didn't want to hear these details at all. They thought they could be prejudicial, which goes to, I think, the second word that Renato used, which is damaging. Do you think that this has been damaging, or is that really not relevant? Whatever they think of Donald Trump and whether or not as a married man he should have had an alleged sexual encounter, it's all irrelevant.
Well, the thing is, you're seeing some arguments that are aimed at the jury. You're seeing some arguments that are really just aimed at their own client and the politics of the situation. You saw that in earlier argument about the gag order. It could have been that the most effective way to deal with that with the judge say, we're really sorry, it won't happen again, and there won't be any more violations. But instead, you got this whole song and dance to the judge about the gag order is ambiguous, that we have to speak, that and it was a different kind of argument, and it wound up basically losing at the end of the day. You're seeing that a lot with this testimony as well. Extortion, that it was false. It doesn't really matter. So for the politics of it, it matters a lot. This is his one opportunity to have his lawyers cross-examine Stormy Daniels to say, this isn't true. She's a liar. She was extorting me. As for the case itself, none of it matters. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false. All that matters is that this is the story that was going to come out right before the election. This is the story that Donald Trump sought to cover up. And he sought to cover it up by paying her money in violation of the federal campaign finance laws.
So in that sense, it bolsters the prosecution argument.
All of this helps the prosecution in every way. There's nothing to this, to any of the noise around whether she's lying or extorting him that really matters at the end of the day. And frankly, the harder they go at it, the better it is for the prosecution, because they're really proving the point. Trump cares a lot about this story. Trump cares about these allegations. He wants to show they're false. They're very embarrassing. They're getting under his skin. And that is precisely why he wanted to cover it up by paying her the money in the first place.
John Allen, as you cover politics, the president, the former president, I should say, has managed so far to portray himself with all of these 4 trials, all of the indictments, as a victim. And his fundraising and his popularity grew after the initial, Alvin Bragg prosecution, and continuously grew. Is there any way to game how this kind of testimony is going to impact the campaign? Because we've been saying, well, we'll see what happens if there is a conviction or an acquittal. But now you've got a witness like Stormy Daniels. What impact does this have beyond the jury?
So certainly he benefited from the prosecutions against him during the primary. Republicans, bound themselves to him. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to be the case in the general election, but in terms of Stormy Daniels' testimony, it's certainly it's stronger than just the suggestion that was out there before, to have her on a witness stand. Now, what we don't have in Judge Merchan's courtroom is cameras. there's not video of this, right? So it's not the kind of thing that plays on a loop. But I do think that that there's a dynamic at play. I want to go back to the politics and something Renato said earlier. He was talking about the defense and why the defense wouldn't just concede that Trump had an affair with Stormy Daniels or that it's not an issue that matters. And even if Trump did have this alleged affair, for him, he wants his base, he wants the people who support him to be able to go out there and believe and say and convince others that he's the right guy to run for president. He wants to show them strength. He's somebody who believes that apologizing or conceding things is a weakness, not a strength. So to go out there and defend himself against the allegation of this extramarital affair is something that I think is politically important to him, even if it's at odds with his best legal case.
And Renato, let's talk about this witness. She's known as, across the country, as a porn star, as Stormy Daniels. She says that's the name she prefers. We saw the prosecution asking her to recount her childhood, the fact that she got a scholarship from Texas A&M. How important was it to humanize her and to show the considerable work that she did, the work ethic, and, you know, how she was building a career?
Yeah, it was really important for the prosecution to do for two reasons. One is, as I alluded to earlier, they want to make it painful for the defense if they're going to attack her very viciously. They want the defense to pay a price if they go after her really hard and are very cruel towards her, because if the jury actually likes her as a person and she is somebody who a lot of jurors are going to like, that is going to create a situation where the defense is going to be pulling some punches, so they're going to have to pay a price if they go after her hard, as Trump probably wants her to do for political or personal reasons. But secondly, Trump took advantage of her desire to become more than what she was, her ambition, her desire to try to improve herself, at least according to her testimony. And they want to show that this is not just a, quote, porn star where you're essentially, they have some negative stereotype the jury might have. This is a human being who was promising and intelligent and had ambitions and desires just like everybody else. And according to the prosecution and the testimony of Stormy Daniels, Donald Trump wanted to take advantage of that to get what he wanted out of her.
And you've got a jury here of 7 men and 5 women. How much does gender play a role in, you know, well past jury selection, but how jurors can react to this?
Well, I will just say that I think there's definitely more of a danger of men stereotyping her, and I think that's precisely why they're trying to humanize her. But I really think that Trump has to be concerned about women identifying themselves with Stormy Daniels. Not everybody, of course, is an adult entertainment artist, but everybody, and particularly women, have experiences with power dynamics. People, whoever you are, have the experience of being taken advantage of by somebody who's more powerful than you, of being in a situation where you're uncomfortable and feel like you have to go along to do something you would prefer not to do, but you feel like that's the right thing to do in the moment or your only choice in the moment. That is what the prosecutors are trying to do, to make her a human being, to make her someone that everyone can identify with, particularly women who often, unfortunately, are put in situations and dynamics where men can take advantage of them.